What would you do if you found a heavy gold ring shaped like a winged skull in the dirt? For 23-year-old waitress Chloe, picking up that piece of jewelry was a fatal mistake. Within 24 hours, the Hells Angels locked down her town, and she became their prime suspect. The town of Caliente, Nevada, wasn't a place people moved to. It was a place people ended up, flanked by barren red rock and a stretch of Highway 93 that seemed to stretch into eternity. It was a dusty pit stop for truckers, road trippers, and ghosts. Chloe Henderson had been working the late shift at the Copper Skillet Diner for 3 years, saving every wrinkled dollar bill she earned to pay her way through a nursing program in Reno. She knew every local by their coffee order and every transient by the tired look in their eyes. But the man who walked into the diner at 11:45 p.m. on a wind-blown Tuesday didn't look tired. He looked like a storm looking for a place to break. The bell above the door didn't just jingle. It slammed against the glass as he pushed his way inside. He was a mountain of a man, clad in heavily scuffed dark denim and a thick leather vest. The air in the diner instantly seemed to grow cold. Chloe, wiping down the laminated surface of the counter, froze. She didn't need to be a biker aficionado to recognize the infamous Death Head logo, the winged skull embroidered on the back of his vest. Above it, the top rocker read Hells Angels, and below it, the bottom rocker declared Oakland. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. The two elderly truckers in the corner booth suddenly found their lukewarm coffee incredibly fascinating, lowering their heads and avoiding eye contact. The biker took a seat at the furthest stool, the leather of his vest groaning as he settled. His massive hands, covered in faded tattoos and thick silver rings, rested flat on the counter. His knuckles were raw, the skin split and angry red, as if he had recently used them to shatter bone. "Black coffee," he rumbled. His voice was like gravel being crushed under a tire. "And a slice of whatever pie is fresh." Chloe swallowed hard, pasting on her best customer service smile, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured the coffee. "Cherry, sir. Baked it this morning. This," he merely grunted. For 20 agonizing minutes. The only sounds in the copper skillet were the buzzing of the neon sign outside and the scrape of the man's fork against the ceramic plate. When he finished, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, and tossed it onto the counter. He stood up, adjusted his heavy belt, and strode out the door without waiting for his change. Chloe let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She watched through the grease-stained window as he kicked over a massive, customized Harley-Davidson. The engine roared to life with a deafening, chest-rattling boom, tearing out of the gravel parking lot and disappearing into the pitch-black desert night. It wasn't until Chloe went out to lock the front doors at 2 a.m. and take the trash to the dumpsters that she saw it. The wind had picked up, swirling desert dust around her ankles. There, glinting under the flickering pale yellow light of the parking lot lamp, was a piece of metal half buried in the loose gravel, right where the biker had parked his Harley. Chloe knelt, brushing the dirt away. It was a ring, but calling it a ring felt like a profound understatement. It was a massive, incredibly heavy piece of solid gold and silver. The face of it was deeply engraved with the unmistakable winged skull. Flanking the skull were the numbers 8 and 1, representing the 8th and 1st letters of the alphabet, H and A. On the inside of the thick band, she could see a tiny engraving, A for Angels, forever, forever angels. A chill shot down her spine. The raw weight of it in her palm felt dangerous. It felt like something that didn't belong to the normal world. She slipped it into the pocket of her apron, finished dragging the trash bags to the dumpster, and locked up the diner, her heart hammering against her ribs. When Chloe got back to her cramped, single-story rental house on the edge of town, her older brother, Jackson, was still awake, covered in motor oil and tinkering with a carburetor at the kitchen table. Jackson worked at the only auto shop in Caliente and knew every inch of engine mechanics and road law. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jackson noted, wiping his greasy hands on a rag as she locked the deadbolt behind her with entirely too much force. Chloe didn't say a word. She reached into her apron pocket and dropped the heavy ring onto the Formica kitchen table. It landed with a dense, authoritative thud. Jackson's eyes dropped to the piece of jewelry. All the color instantly drained from his face. He didn't reach for it. He didn't even want his hands near it. He slowly backed his chair away from the table. "Chloe," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Where did you get that?" "A guy left it at the diner tonight. He dropped it in the parking lot. Big guy, leather vest, from Oakland. Do you have any idea what this is?" Jackson's breathing hitched. He finally reached out with the tip of his screwdriver and nudged the ring to see the side. "Oh, God, it has the filthy few diamond on the side. Chloe, you need to listen to me very, very carefully." Chloe felt a knot of pure panic tighten in her stomach. "What, I was just going to give it to the local police in the morning. Let Sheriff Miller deal with it." "No," Jackson snapped, louder than he intended. "You do not involve the cops. This isn't a lost wallet. Chloe, this is a Hell's Angels Club ring. In their world, this is a sacred piece of property. The club owns it, not the individual. A patch member losing his ring or his colors is a massive violation. If the wrong people find out he lost it, he's in deep trouble with his own brothers. And if they find out a civilian like you has it..." Jackson swallowed hard. "They might think you stole it. Or worse, that you disrespected the club. People have disappeared for a lot less. So what do I do?" Chloe panicked, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. "I can't just throw it away. If they come looking for it and find out I threw it in the trash, they'll kill me." "We mail it," Jackson said, thinking rapidly. "Tomorrow. We put it in an unmarked envelope, no return address, and we mail it to the Oakland clubhouse. We wipe it for prints. We never, ever speak of this again. It was a solid plan. It was the safest option. But fate in the Nevada desert is rarely kind, and time was a luxury Chloe and Jackson no longer had." Wednesday morning began exactly like every other morning in Caliente. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the asphalt, and the wind kicked up the usual dust devils. Chloe arrived at the Copper Skillet at 8 a.m., exhausted. She hadn't slept a wink. The massive gold and silver ring felt like a radioactive isotope wrapped in a napkin inside her purse, tucked securely behind the diner's counter. She had planned to hit the post office on her lunch break, exactly as Jackson had instructed. At 9:15 a.m., the diner was moderately busy. Pete, the fry cook and owner, was slamming spatulas against the griddle, while a mix of locals and passing tourists quietly ate their eggs and bacon. Then, the ground began to vibrate. It didn't start as a sound, it started as a physical sensation. The coffee in the glass carafes began to ripple, exactly like the water glass in Jurassic Park. The heavy diner mugs jittered against their saucers. Then came the noise. It was a low, guttural, synchronized roar that seemed to swallow the entire town. It sounded like a squadron of bombers flying 10 feet off the ground. Pete stopped scraping the griddle. The tourists stopped eating. Chloe's blood turned to ice water. She walked slowly to the front window and peered through the blinds. Down the center of Highway 93, a terrifying procession was approaching. It wasn't one or two bikers. It was a column, riding two abreast in perfect, militaristic formation. 10, 20, 40. There had to be at least 50 heavily customized Harley-Davidsons, their chrome gleaming fiercely under the desert sun. Leading the pack were riders flying the notorious red and white patches of the Hells Angels. The town of Caliente reacted on pure, primal instinct. Down the street, the hardware store owner frantically pulled down his metal security grate. Cars parked along the main drag abruptly started up and tore down side streets, desperate to get out of the way. Pedestrians literally vanished, bolting into alleys and storefronts. "Chloe," Pete said, his voice unusually high-pitched. "Lock the door." But it was too late. The column didn't pass through town. As the lead rider reached the copper skillet, he raised a single, gloved fist into the air. The entire pack slowed, their engines dropping to an idle that shook the diner's plate glass windows in their frames. They swarmed the gravel parking lot, surrounding the building in a sea of leather, steel, and exhaust smoke. They parked with practiced precision, kicking down their kickstands in unison. Chloe stood frozen behind the cash register, her purse resting on the shelf below, less than a foot from her shaking knees. Inside that purse was a piece of their Brotherhood. The front door didn't jingle. It was practically torn off its hinges as 5 massive men strode inside. They didn't look like the lone rider from the night before. They looked organized. They looked furious. At the front was a man who seemed to take up the entire doorway. He had a thick, graying beard, dark sunglasses, and a terrifying scar that jagged down his cheek and disappeared into his collar. The patch on his chest read, "President." Behind him was a younger, fiercely athletic man whose patch read, "Ace GT," at arms. The diner fell dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. The only sound was the sizzling of bacon left unattended on Pete's griddle. "Which one of you is running this joint?" the president asked. His voice was completely calm, devoid of any shouting or theatrics, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Pete, wiping his hands on a greasy towel, stepped out from the kitchen, trembling. I am Pete Donovan. Can I get you gentlemen something to eat? We're not here for the eggs." "Pete," the president said smoothly, removing his sunglasses. His eyes were cold, calculating, and dead. "We're here because we have a problem, and we think your little establishment is right in the middle of it." Chloe felt her vision blur around the edges. She squeezed her eyes shut for a microsecond, willing herself not to faint. "They know," she thought wildly. "They know I have the ring." The sergeant-at-arms stepped forward, slamming a heavy combat boot onto the bottom rung of a bar stool. "Last night, one of our brothers rode through this town. Big guy. Name's Bear. O'Connor. He stopped here around midnight for coffee." Chloe's heart stopped. She nodded slowly, instinctively, before she could stop herself. The sergeant-at-arms locked eyes with her. "You served him, sweetheart." Yes," Chloe whispered, her vocal cords feeling like sandpaper. "Black coffee, cherry pie, Kerry. Well, ain't that sweet," the president said, his voice dropping an octave. "Here's the problem. Chloe. Bear never made it to his destination. A trucker found him this morning, dumped in a dry wash about 8 miles south of here. Somebody ran him off the road. Somebody took a crowbar to his skull. He's in a medically induced coma at the county hospital." The room spun. Chloe gripped the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. The biker from last night hadn't just carelessly lost his ring. He had been ambushed. Now, the president continued, taking a slow step closer to the counter, his massive frame towering over Chloe. Bear is a tough son of a bitch. Whoever hit him, it wasn't a fair fight. They left his bike, they left his wallet, but they took something else. They took his club ring. Chloe stopped breathing. The air in the diner felt utterly devoid of oxygen. The ring in her purse suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "We track our own," the sergeant-at-arms growled, leaning over the counter so close Chloe could smell the stale tobacco and peppermint on his breath. "Word on the highway is, some local desert rats were eyeing him when he rode through. We think whoever ambushed him watched him leave this diner. We think whoever took his ring is right here in Caliente." The president slammed his massive, ring-covered hand flat on the laminated counter, making Chloe jump violently. "So I'm going to ask you once, sweetheart, and you better think very, very carefully before you answer. What did you see last night? Who was in here? And do you know anything about a gold-winged skull?" If Chloe told the truth, if she reached into her purse and handed them the ring, they wouldn't believe she just found it. Not after learning their brother had been brutally beaten and robbed. In their eyes, whoever possessed that ring was either the attacker or an accomplice to the ambush. She would be signing her own death warrant, and probably her brother Jackson's, too. But if she lied, and they somehow found it on her, or if someone saw her pick it up last night, 50 Hell's Angels were standing outside. 5 of their most dangerous leaders were inside, and the most incriminating piece of evidence in Nevada was resting less than 12 inches from Chloe's shaking hands. Chloe started, looking into the dead eyes of the club president, her mind racing desperately for a way out. Chloe started, looking into the dead, unblinking eyes of the club president. Her mind raced desperately for a way out, her pulse pounding a frantic rhythm against her eardrums. I served him. Just like I said. He drank his coffee, ate his pie, and left. He didn't speak to anyone. He just rode off south. The president leaned in closer. His name tag read Dutch. Nobody followed him. No locals hanging around the parking lot. No. Chloe lied, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the sheer terror gripping her lungs. Just 2 out-of-state truckers in the corner booth, and they left an hour after he did. I locked up alone. Dutch stared at her for what felt like an eternity. He was a human lie detector, hardened by decades of outlaw life. He narrowed his eyes, studying the subtle trembling of her hands resting on the counter, inches above her hidden purse. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sudden wail of police sirens shattered the heavy silence. Through the plate-glass window, 2 Caliente Sheriff's Department cruisers skidded into the gravel lot, their light bars flashing frantically, casting harsh red and blue shadows over the sea of parked Harley-Davidsons. The local law enforcement was vastly outnumbered. 50-2. The diner door swung open, and Sheriff Miller stepped in, looking visibly pale and sweating through his khaki uniform. Right behind him was Deputy Sullivan, a heavily built, arrogant local who had a reputation for being a bully with a badge. "All right, everyone just take a breath," Sheriff Miller announced, his hand resting nervously on his duty belt. "Dutch, you and your boys are causing a panic. You need to clear out of Caliente." Dutch slowly turned away from Chloe, his lips curling into a cold, menacing smile. "Miller, your town is bleeding onto my club's boots. One of my brothers was nearly beaten to death down in Miller's Wash last night. And whoever did it took his club ring. We aren't leaving until we find the rat who swung the crowbar. Deputy Sullivan pushed past the sheriff, puffing out his chest. "We're handling the investigation. Dutch, your biker buddy probably got drunk and wrecked his own ride. Now get your gang out of my jurisdiction before I start making arrests." As Sullivan stepped forward into the diner's harsh fluorescent light, Chloe's eyes darted down. Caliente was a dusty town, surrounded by pale, dry dirt. But the dry wash 8 miles south, the place where Bear had been found dumped, was a dried-up riverbed famous for its thick, rust-red clay. Caked deep into the treads of Deputy Sullivan's black duty boots, and splattered across the hem of his uniform trousers, was fresh, damp red clay. Chloe's breath hitched. She looked at Sullivan's hands. His right hand was resting on his belt, and his knuckles were visibly bruised and swollen. He did it, Chloe realized, a sickening wave of adrenaline washing over her. Sullivan followed Bear out of the diner. He used his cruiser to run the Harley off the road. He beat him with a crowbar. Sullivan wasn't looking for the ring. He probably turned Bear's pockets inside out, looking for cash or the ring, and came up empty. Unaware that Bear had already dropped it in the diner parking lot before the ambush even happened. "You aren't arresting anyone." "Sullivan." Dutch growled, stepping into the deputy's personal space. The size difference was staggering. Dutch made the bulky deputy look like a child. "In fact, I think you locals are covering for the scum who did this. Watch your mouth. Biker!" Sullivan spat, his hand twitching toward his holstered sidearm. The tension in the room snapped tight as piano wire. The sergeant-at-arms unclipped a heavy folding knife from his belt. Pete the fry cook whimpered and ducked behind the grill. A bloodbath was seconds away from erupting right in the middle of the copper skillet. Chloe knew she had exactly one chance to redirect the crosshairs. If they searched her to secure the room, they would find the ring in her purse. She had to shift Dutch's full attention, permanently, onto the man who actually committed the crime. "Excuse me," Chloe said. Her voice was loud, cutting through the standoff. Every eye in the diner snapped to her. Dutch turned his head, his scarred face twisted in annoyance. Sullivan glared at her, his eyes silently threatening her to shut up. I just remembered something," Chloe stammered, stepping out from behind the counter, leaving her purse behind. She pointed a shaking finger at Sullivan's boots. "Deputy Sullivan, you came in for coffee late last night, after my shift. You were parked down the road, I remember, because of the mud." Sullivan's face drained of all color. "Shut up. Chloe, you don't know what you're talking about." "The red clay," Chloe continued, her voice gaining strength as she looked directly at Dutch. "There's no red mud in town. It hasn't rained here in a month. The only place with wet red clay right now is the underground spring down at Miller's Wash, exactly where your friend was found." Dutch's eyes slowly tracked down to Deputy Sullivan's boots. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The sergeant-at-arms moved with terrifying speed, stepping laterally to block the diner's exit. Sheriff Miller looked at his deputy, shock registering on his face. "Sullivan, were you out at the wash last night? Your radio was dark for 2 hours." "She's lying!" Sullivan shouted, genuine panic cracking his arrogant facade. He took a step back, his hand gripping the butt of his gun. "This little waitress is just trying to protect her own skin. They probably stole the biker's ring themselves." "Ring," Dutch echoed softly. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "I didn't say what kind of jewelry was stolen, Deputy. I just said club ring. Could have been a pinky ring. Could have been a necklace. How did you know it was a ring?" Sullivan froze. He had slipped. In his desperate panic to frame Chloe, He had revealed details of the robbery that only the attacker would know. "Take his gun," Dutch ordered, his voice echoing like thunder. Before Sullivan could unholster his weapon, the sergeant-at-arms and 2 other massive angels descended on him. It was a brutally efficient takedown. They slammed the deputy face first into the diner counter, disarming him in a fraction of a second. The metallic clatter of Sullivan's service pistol hitting the linoleum floor sounded like a gunshot. "Sheriff," Dutch said, not taking his eyes off the struggling deputy. "I suggest you step outside and look the other way. Or you can join your boy on the floor." Sheriff Miller, vastly outgunned, and realizing his own deputy was a corrupt, murderous thief, slowly raised his hands and backed out the front door, leaving Sullivan to the wolves. "Let's go check the trunk of his cruiser. Brothers." The sergeant-at-arms growled, hauling a bleeding Sullivan to his feet by the collar of his uniform. "I bet we'll find a bloody tire iron and some fresh dents on his push bumper." As the angels dragged the screaming deputy out the front door of the diner, the rest of the pack outside surged forward, swarming the police cruiser like angry hornets. The chaotic distraction was absolute. Chloe knew this was her window. It was the only one she would ever get. She ducked behind the counter, unzipped her purse, and grabbed the heavy gold-winged skull ring. She shoved it deep into the pocket of her jeans. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely feel her fingers. She walked quickly out the front door of the diner, stepping onto the porch. The parking lot was a madhouse. 50 bikers were crowding around the police car. The sergeant-at-arms had popped the trunk and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar, the tip stained with dried, dark blood. The roar of fury from the Hells Angels shook the ground. Dutch's custom Harley-Davidson was parked just 3 feet from the diner steps. Attached to the rear fender was a pair of thick, unbuckled black leather saddlebags. Heart in her throat, praying to any god that would listen. Chloe stepped off the porch. She pretended to stumble, bracing herself against the leather seat of Dutch's bike. With a sleight of hand, born of pure, unadulterated terror, she slipped her hand into her pocket, palmed the heavy gold ring, and let it drop silently into the dark depths of the leather saddlebag. She immediately stepped back, pressing her back against the diner wall, hyperventilating. Dutch turned away from the commotion at the police car and walked back toward his bike. He stopped and looked at Chloe, his cold, dead eyes studying her pale, terrified face. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his leather vest, pulled out a thick wad of cash, peeled off a crisp $100 bill, and flicked it onto the gravel at Chloe's feet. "For the broken door," Dutch rumbled. He swung his massive leg over his Harley and kicked the engine to life. The deafening roar signaled the rest of the pack. They released Sullivan, leaving him beaten and handcuffed to the steering wheel of his own cruiser for the state police to find, the bloody crowbar resting on his lap as evidence. Within 60 seconds, the entire column of Hell's Angels peeled out of the Copper Skillet parking lot, tearing down Highway 93, leaving nothing but a massive cloud of dust and the smell of exhaust in their wake. Chloe slid down the brick wall of the diner, collapsing onto the gravel, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. She was alive. The ring was gone, returned to the president without him ever knowing she possessed it. The corrupt deputy had met his fate. And Caliente, Nevada, would never be the same. Later that night, as Jackson held a trembling Chloe in their small kitchen, they listened to the police scanner. State troopers had arrested Sullivan for attempted murder and highway robbery, and hundreds of miles away, rolling into the Oakland clubhouse, a president would unpack his saddlebags, find a sacred piece of gold nestled among his gear, and believe that the Brotherhood's guardian angels had simply brought it home. Did Chloe make the right move, or was it pure luck that saved her from the angel's wrath? Drop a comment below with what you would have done in her shoes. If this real-life desert thriller kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more crazy true stories. See you in the next video. A 12-year-old boy steps into oncoming traffic to save a battered pit bull. He didn't know the dog belonged to the president of a notorious Hells Angels chapter. What started as a desperate rescue turned into a dangerous debt of honor, triggering a chain of events that would alter both their lives forever. The San Bernardino sun was unforgiving, baking the cracked asphalt of Route 66 until the air above it shimmered like water. 12-year-old Leo Foster sat on the curb outside the Rusty Spoon, kicking at loose gravel. His mother, Sarah, was inside, pulling her second double shift of the week. Leo's world was a blur of overdue bills, eviction notices, and the constant, gnawing anxiety of a family hovering right on the edge of ruin. He was a quiet kid, small for his age, with watchful eyes that had seen too much struggle and too little grace. Across the 4-lane highway, a massive convoy of motorcycles rumbled into the Chevron station. The guttural roar of the V-twin engines rattled the glass of the diner's windows. Leo watched them with a mix of awe and ingrained fear. There were about 15 of them, clad in heavy denim and worn leather. On their backs, the unmistakable insignia, the winged death's head of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. At the front of the pack rode a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. His name was Thomas Bear Harrison, the president of the local charter. Bear was 6'4", heavily bearded, with arms wrapped in faded prison ink and a scar that snaked from his ear down to his collarbone. Straddling the gas tank of Bear's custom, Chopped Harley was a dog. It was a massive, block-headed Mastiff Pit Bull mix named Dozer. The dog wore a thick leather collar adorned with iron spikes. Bear parked his bike, ordered Dozer to stay, and walked into the convenience store with a few of his brothers. Dozer was a fiercely loyal dog, but he was also terrified of sudden, sharp noises. As Bear disappeared inside, a rusted-out pickup truck tore down the highway, its exhaust backfiring with a sound exactly like a gunshot. The explosive crack echoed off the concrete. Panic seized the massive dog. Dozer scrambled off the leather seat, his heavy paws slipping on the slick pavement, blinded by fear. The dog bolted away from the gas station, darting straight toward the blistering, chaotic traffic of Route 66. Leo stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the dog freeze in the center lane, disoriented by the blaring horns and the rushing metal. Then, Leo saw the semi-truck. It was a massive 18-wheeler, barreling down the eastbound lane, hauling timber. The driver was laying on the air horn, a deafening, terrifying blast that paralyzed the dog completely. Dozer just stood there, shaking, trapped in the crosshairs of 30 tons of moving steel. The truck driver slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming, smoking, leaving long black scars on the asphalt. But there wasn't enough time. The momentum was too great. Leo didn't think. He didn't weigh the odds. He just moved. He sprinted off the curb, his worn-out sneakers pounding the burning blacktop. He ducked past a swerving sedan, the side mirror clipping his shoulder, spinning him around. He regained his footing and dove. He slammed into the heavy dog just as the grill of the 18-wheeler eclipsed the sun. Leo and Dozer rolled hard across the rough asphalt, tumbling into the dusty gravel of the median. A split second later, the semi-truck roared past, the vacuum of its wake pulling violently at Leo's tattered t-shirt. The massive tires missed the boy's legs by inches. For a moment, the world was nothing but the smell of burned rubber, diesel exhaust, and the stinging pain of scraped flesh. Leo lay in the dirt, gasping for air, his arms wrapped tightly around the trembling, heavy frame of the dog. Dozer whined, licking the dirt and blood from Leo's scraped chin. Then, the screaming started. Dozer. The voice was a booming, terrifying roar that cut through the noise of the traffic. Leo looked up, blinking through the dust. Bear Harrison was sprinting across the highway, dodging cars with reckless abandon, his face pale beneath his heavy beard. Behind him, a dozen Hell's Angels dropped their gas pumps and followed, a tidal wave of leather and muscle rushing toward the median. Leo froze, his chest heaved. He had grown up hearing stories about these men, violent, unpredictable outlaws. He slowly let go of the dog, pushing himself backward into the dirt, expecting the worst. He thought the giant man was going to kill him for putting his hands on his animal. Bear dropped to his knees in the gravel. He didn't even look at the boy at first. He grabbed Dozer's heavy head in his massive, calloused hands, checking the dog frantically for injuries, burying his bearded face into the dog's neck. The intimidating biker let out a choked, ragged breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. The rest of the club arrived, forming a tight, imposing wall around them, blocking the view of the rubbernecking cars. The silence among the men was heavy, dangerous. Bear slowly lifted his head and turned his dark, intense eyes toward Leo. Leo was shivering, blood trickling down his arm from a nasty patch of road rash, his clothes torn. "You—" Bear started, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He stood up, towering over the boy. The other bikers shifted, their expressions unreadable. Leo scrambled to his feet, taking a step back. "I'm sorry," Leo stammered, his voice cracking. "He was in the road. I didn't mean to." Bear held up a massive hand, silencing the boy. The giant biker took a step forward, closing the distance. He looked down at the bleeding kid, then back at the skid marks on the road, calculating how close it had been. To Leo's absolute shock, Bear didn't yell. Instead, he dropped to one knee, bringing himself down to eye level with the terrified 12-year-old. He reached out and gently grasped Leo's shoulder. "You saved my boy," Bear whispered, the harshness completely gone from his voice. "That truck. You saved my best friend's life. Kid, you could have died. I like dogs," Leo muttered, his eyes glued to the winged death's head patch on Bear's chest. Bear let out a low chuckle, a sound of pure relief. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a heavy, silver challenge coin bearing the HAMC insignia and pressed it into Leo's dirty, trembling palm. "My name is Bear," he said, staring intently into Leo's eyes. "What's yours?" "Leo. Listen to me. Leo, you bleed for my family. You become my family. You understand this club owes you a debt, a life for a life. You ever need anything, you show that coin to anyone wearing this patch." Before Leo could process the magnitude of what had just happened, Sarah burst through the crowd of bikers, screaming her son's name. She was terrified, yanking Leo away from the giant men. Bear stood up, his intimidating aura instantly returning. He tipped his head respectfully to Sarah, whistled for Dozer, and walked back across the highway. Leo watched them ride off, the silver coin burning a hole in his pocket. He thought it was the end of a crazy afternoon. He had no idea it was the beginning of a war. Life in the Foster household didn't leave room for fairy tales or superhero moments. 2 weeks after the incident on Highway 99, the memory of the giant biker and the silver coin had faded into the background of a much more immediate nightmare. Sarah and Leo lived in a decaying, ground-floor duplex on the east side of town. The roof leaked, the pipes groaned, and the landlord was a predator. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just a slumlord. He was a local loan shark who preyed on desperate single mothers and vulnerable families. Sarah had borrowed $3,000 from Arthur a year ago to pay for the funeral of Leo's father. With Arthur's exorbitant, compounding interest rates, that debt had ballooned to nearly $9,000. It was a Tuesday night. The air conditioner was broken, and the small living room was stiflingly hot. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, a stack of past-due bills scattered around her. Leo was on the faded sofa, pretending to read a school book, but his eyes kept darting to his mother. He hated feeling so helpless. He hated the dark circles under her eyes. Then came the knock. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a heavy, violent pounding that rattled the cheap wood in its frame. Sarah flinched, her face draining of color. "Go to your room, Leo," she whispered frantically. "Mom, now, Leo, please." Leo backed into the short hallway, but refused to close his bedroom door. He peeked around the corner, just as Sarah unbolted the front door. Arthur Pendleton stood on the porch. He was a thick, greasy man in his late 40s, wearing a sweat-stained dress shirt tight over a protruding gut. He smelled of cheap cigars and stale beer. He didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed his way into the living room, forcing Sarah to stumble backward. "We have a problem, Sarah." Arthur sneered, his eyes scanning the meager apartment with disgust. "You missed your payment. Again." "Arthur, please," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling. "My hours got cut at the diner. I have $400. I can give you that right now, and I'll have the rest by Friday. I promise." Arthur laughed, a dry, cruel sound. He walked over to the kitchen table and picked up a framed photograph of Leo's late father, examining it mockingly. $400 doesn't even cover this week's interest. Sarah, you're bleeding me dry. I'm a businessman, not a charity. I just need a few more days." Arthur slammed the picture frame down on the table, shattering the glass. Sarah screamed, jumping back. "You're out of days," Arthur roared, dropping the facade of the polite businessman. He stepped into her personal space, jabbing a thick, stubby finger into her shoulder. "You owe me $9,000. You're going to pack your trash, and you and that brat are going to be out of my property by tomorrow morning, or I'll have my boys come down here and throw your crap into the street, and we'll see what else you can do to pay off that debt." He reached out and grabbed Sarah violently by the wrist, pulling her toward him. "Do we understand each other?" In the hallway, Leo felt a surge of blind rage. He dropped his book and sprinted into the living room, throwing his small weight against Arthur's side. "Leave my mom alone," Leo screamed, swinging his fists. Arthur grunted in surprise, taking a half step back. He looked down at the boy with pure malice. "You little punk," Arthur hissed. He raised his heavy hand to strike the 12-year-old. Sarah shrieked, diving in front of her son, but the blow never landed. Kriak! The front door, which Arthur had left ajar, swung open violently, slamming against the drywall. The heavy, thudding sound of steel-toed boots echoed on the linoleum. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arthur froze, his hand still raised in the air. He slowly turned around. Standing in the doorway, blocking the streetlights, were 3 massive figures. At the center stood Bear Harrison, Flanking him were two heavily tattooed, stone-faced Hells Angels known on the streets as Jax Miller and Crow Henderson. They were in full colors, their leather cuts creaking as they stepped into the cramped living room. Bear's eyes bypassed Arthur completely. He looked past the slumlord, locking eyes with Leo, and then shifted his gaze to Sarah, noting her terrified posture and the red mark forming on her wrist. The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating. Arthur Pendleton's face went from an angry crimson to a sickly, pale white. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking. "Can I help you, boys?" Arthur managed to squeak out, attempting a bravado he clearly didn't feel. "This is private property." Bear didn't answer him. He took two slow, deliberate steps forward. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He stopped mere inches from Arthur. The top of Arthur's head barely reached Bear's chin. "You Arthur Pendleton?" Bear asked. His voice was quiet, unnervingly quiet. It was the calm before a devastating storm. Yes," Arthur stuttered. "I own this building. I'm just collecting rent." Jax Miller stepped forward, picking up the shattered picture frame from the table. He looked at it, then dropped it into the trash can. "Looks like you're collecting more than rent, Artie." Bear slowly reached into his denim jacket. Arthur flinched, instinctively raising his hands, expecting a weapon. Instead, Bear pulled out a thick roll of $100 bills bound by a rubber band. "The boy," Bear said, his deep voice vibrating in the small room, "is under the protection of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, which means his mother is under the protection of the club." Bear flicked the rubber band off the cash. He didn't hand it to Arthur. He let the heavy stack of hundreds drop onto the cheap linoleum floor, scattering around Arthur's scuffed shoes. "There's $9,000, Bear said coldly. "The debt is paid." Arthur stared at the money, his greed battling with his absolute terror. The interest." He started to whisper, unable to stop his predatory instincts. Faster than a snake strike, Bear's massive hand shot out, grabbing Arthur by the throat. He didn't choke him, but the grip was like a steel vice, lifting Arthur onto his tiptoes. "There is no interest," Bear growled, his face inches from Arthur's sweaty forehead. "There is no more rent. There are no more visits. If I ever hear that you drove down this street, if I ever hear that you looked in this woman's direction, if I even hear you breathe her name in your sleep, me and the boys will come back, and we won't bring money. Do you understand me?" Arthur choked, nodding frantically, his eyes bulging. Bear let go, shoving Arthur backward. The slumlord stumbled, falling hard onto his backside. He scrambled on the floor, frantically grabbing the scattered $100 bills, stuffing them into his pockets with trembling hands. "Get out!" Crow Henderson barked, stepping aside to clear the doorway. Arthur didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet and practically sprinted out the door, tripping over the porch step in his haste to escape the terrifying presence of the bikers. The sound of his car tires squealing down the block echoed in the night. In the living room, the heavy tension slowly evaporated. Bear turned back to Sarah, his entire demeanor softening. He took off his sunglasses and offered her a surprisingly gentle, apologetic look. "Ma'am," Bear said, his voice respectful. "I apologize for the intrusion, and for the mess. We had some boys keeping an eye on the neighborhood to make sure Leo was all right. They saw that piece of garbage force his way in." Sarah was shaking, her mind unable to process the whiplash of the last 5 minutes. You just paid him $9,000. I can't pay you back. I don't have—" "Stop," Bear interrupted softly. "You don't owe us a dime. Your son stepped in front of 30 tons of steel to save my dog. He gave me my family back." Bear looked down at Leo, a small, proud smile touching his bearded face. "I told him we owed him a debt. The angels pay their debts." Bear reached out and ruffled Leo's hair, treating the boy not like a kid, but like an equal. "You did good tonight, kid," standing up to him like that. Before Sarah could formulate a response, Bear tipped an imaginary hat to her. "Have a good night, Mrs. Foster. You won't be bothered again." The three massive men turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the night as quietly as they had arrived. Leo stood in the hallway, staring at the empty doorway, the silver challenge coin heavy in his pocket. He had saved a dog, but he was beginning to realize that the men who rode with the death's head patched on their backs had just saved him. But as the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, Sarah pulled Leo into a tight, desperate hug. She wasn't just relieved. She was terrified, because she knew something her 12-year-old son didn't. When you owe your life to outlaws, the bill always comes due. And the real twist of fate hadn't even begun to show its teeth. For a month, the Foster duplex was peaceful. For the first time in his life, Leo didn't wake up to the sound of his mother crying over the calculator. The suffocating weight of Arthur Pendleton's debt had vanished, replaced by a cautious, fragile optimism. But in a city where the streets have eyes, outlaws aren't the only predators lurking in the shadows. It started on a gloomy Thursday afternoon. Sarah was putting away groceries when a heavy knock hammered against the front door. Expecting the mailman, she pulled it open, only to find two men in cheap, off-the-rack suits standing on her porch. The lead man flashed a gold badge. "Detective Ray Caldwell, San Bernardino PD. We need to step inside. Mrs. Foster." Caldwell didn't wait for permission. He brushed past her, his partner closing the door behind them. Caldwell had cold, dead eyes, and the smug arrogance of a man who enjoyed cornering his prey. He paced the small living room, taking in the cheap furniture before turning a hard stare on Sarah. "Arthur Pendleton came to us with an interesting story," Caldwell began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "He checked into the ER 3 weeks ago with severe bruising and a stress-induced heart palpitation. He claims you hired Thomas Bear, Harrison, and the Hells Angels to extort him, threaten his life, and rob him of $9,000. "That's a lie," Sarah gasped, her blood running cold. "Arthur was extorting us. He was going to throw us out on the street. Bear. Mister. Harrison just paid my debt. He didn't rob anyone." Caldwell smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's a touching narrative, unfortunately. Bear Harrison is the target of a 3-year federal racketeering probe. And right now, Mrs. Foster, you look like an accomplice to armed robbery and gang affiliation. That carries a mandatory minimum of 10 years. Sarah stumbled back, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter to keep from collapsing. "I haven't done anything wrong. You can't take me away from my son." "I don't want to," Caldwell said, leaning in close. "I want Harrison. So, here's the deal. We know Harrison checks in on you. The next time he does, you're going to wear a wire. You're going to get him on tape admitting he assaulted Pendleton on your behalf. You do that, and you and the boy walk away clean. If you refuse, I call Child Protective Services right now, and Leo goes into the foster system while you wait for trial in county lockup. From the cracked door of his bedroom, Leo heard everything. His stomach twisted into a violent knot. The police, the people supposed to protect them, were using his mother as bait to trap the only man who had ever truly helped them. Caldwell gave Sarah 48 hours to decide and left, leaving a suffocating silence in his wake. Sarah collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Leo knew his mother would do it. She would wear the wire, betray Bear, and risk the wrath of the Hells Angels, all to keep Leo out of a group home. But Leo also knew what happened to people who wore wires against the cartel or the club. They didn't live long enough to testify. That night, while Sarah slept an exhausted, tear-stained sleep, Leo made his choice. He quietly slipped out of his bedroom window, grabbed his rusted BMX bike, and pedaled into the darkest part of town. The Hells Angels clubhouse was an imposing fortress surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Dozens of custom Harleys were lined up under harsh halogen floodlights. Heavy metal music thumped from inside the reinforced cinder block building. Leo rode up to the heavy iron gate, a massive prospect with a shaved head and a neck tattoo of a spiderweb stepped out of the guard shack, shining a blinding flashlight directly into Leo's face. "You're lost, kid. Turn the bike around." The prospect growled. Leo squinted against the light. His hands were shaking, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy silver challenge coin. He held it up through the chain-link fence. "I need to see Bear," Leo said, his voice surprisingly steady. "He gave me this." The prospect lowered the flashlight, staring at the winged death's head on the coin. His demeanor shifted instantly. He unlocked the gate. "Leave the bike. Follow me." "Follow." Leo was led through a maze of leather-clad men, billiard tables, and thick cigar smoke until he reached a back office. Bear was sitting behind a massive oak desk. Going over ledgers, Jax Miller and Crow Henderson flanked him. Bear looked up, genuine surprise crossing his rugged features. "Leo, what the hell are you doing here at 2 a.m? Leo didn't waste time. He spilled everything. He told them about Detective Caldwell, the threats of foster care, and the plan to make his mother wear a wire. The temperature in the room plummeted. Jax Miller cursed under his breath, his hand instinctively dropping to his belt. Bear simply sat back in his heavy leather chair, his dark eyes boring into the wall as he processed the information. "You understand what you just did, Leo?" Bear asked quietly. "By coming here, you protected my family. But if Caldwell finds out you warned me, he'll destroy your mother." "You saved us," Leo said, his chin held high despite his fear. "A life for a life. That's what you said." Bear stared at the brave 12-year-old for a long, silent moment. Then, a slow, dangerous smile crept across his bearded face. "All right, little brother. You did your part. Now, let the angels handle the law." 2 days later, Detective Caldwell swaggered up to the Fosters' duplex, carrying a briefcase containing the surveillance wire. He didn't bother knocking, expecting a broken, compliant Sarah to let him in. He turned the handle and pushed the door open. "All right, Sarah, time to prep." Caldwell started, but the words died in his throat. Sitting on the faded floral sofa wasn't Sarah. It was Bear Harrison, looking entirely relaxed, flanked by Jax and Crow. Sitting in the armchair to Bear's right was a man in a crisp, $5,000 Armani suit, holding a polished leather notepad. Sarah and Leo were nowhere to be seen. Caldwell froze, his hand dropping toward his service weapon. "What the hell is this? Where is Mrs. Foster?" The man in the suit stood up, adjusting his silk tie. "Mrs. Foster and her son are currently checking into a luxury suite at the Four Seasons, paid for by a private trust. My name is Richard Sterling, senior partner at Sterling and Vance Defense. I represent Mr. Harrison, and as of this morning, I am on retainer for Mrs. Sarah Foster." Caldwell's face paled. Richard Sterling was the most ruthless, expensive criminal defense attorney on the West Coast. He destroyed careers for sport. "This is an ongoing police investigation," Caldwell stammered. "This is criminal extortion," Sterling countered, his voice sharp as a scalpel. "You threatened a single mother with the removal of her child to manufacture evidence against my client. We have statements. We have your illegal threats documented, and my private investigators have already pulled the internal affairs file regarding your little habit of suborning perjury." Sterling took a step forward, towering over the detective. "Here is what is going to happen. Detective Caldwell, you are going to walk out of this house. You are going to permanently close whatever fictional file you have on Sarah Foster. If you ever come within 100 yards of her, her son, or my client without a signed warrant from a superior court judge, I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your natural life in a federal penitentiary with the very men you put away. Do we have an understanding?" Caldwell looked at Sterling, then at Bear, who offered a cold, mocking wink. The detective knew he was beaten. He swallowed his pride, turned on his heel, and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Bear let out a low chuckle, pulling a thick cigar from his vest. "Well played, Richard." That day changed the trajectory of Leo Foster's life forever. The Hells Angels didn't just walk away after defeating the corrupt cop. Bear Harrison understood the boy's potential and the dangerous reality of their world. He refused to let Leo be pulled into the criminal underworld. Instead, Bear set up an anonymous educational trust fund. Every tuition bill, every book, every expense was paid for in cash by private donors. Bear became a distant but fiercely protective surrogate father. Enforcing strict rules, Leo was to get straight A's, stay away from gangs, and never ride a motorcycle. 15 years later, the dust of San Bernardino still blew hot. But Leo Foster wasn't sitting on the curb. Doctor. Leo Foster stood in the pristine examination room of his own veterinary clinic, wearing a white coat. He gently bandaged the paw of a nervous rescue pit bull. The bell above the clinic door rang. The massive, intimidating figure of Bear Harrison, now entirely grey-bearded, but no less imposing, walked in. He was holding the leash of a young, energetic mastiff puppy. Leo smiled, wiping his hands and walking around the counter to embrace the giant biker. It was a collision of two entirely different worlds, bound together by blood, honor, and a 12-year-old boy's courage. Leo had saved a biker's dog from the street, and in return, the Hells Angels had given him the ultimate protection, the freedom to build a beautiful life. Would you have risked it all to warn the Hells Angels, or would you have trusted the police? Leo's incredible choice proves that sometimes the most dangerous people hold the strongest codes of honor. If this story of loyalty and redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life stories.